They stared like I was burying a body. No questions, no greetings, just silent stares from kitchen windows and passing golf carts, eyes full of suspicion and fear. But I wasn't hiding anything. I was planting food, turnips first, then potatoes. Later came the green beans, tomatoes, collards, and the herbs, the ones I'd learned to grow in a desert tent halfway around the world. Everything had a place. Rows aligned like formation drills. Water trenches, compost imported from a local farm. Soil tested, pH balanced. I wasn't guessing. I was preparing. 3 acres, barely a whisper of land left over from my family's homestead before the suburbs rolled in like cement tides. My patch stood at the edge of Fair Hollow Estates, the kind of neighborhood where every mailbox matched and every home looked like a real estate catalog exploded in symmetry. They built around me. I didn't object. People needed homes. But what I didn't see coming was how badly they wanted to erase what came before them. They called themselves the Fair Hollow Community Board. But they were an HOA, and not the quiet kind. It started small, a tap on the door, clipboard in hand, coffee cup in the other. Her name was Melissa Whitley, but everyone called her Karen behind her back. Tight smile, camera-ready phone grip. The kind of woman who weaponized politeness and dressed it up like civic duty. "Mr. Callahan," she said, leaning in like she expected to see chickens pecking around my living room. "We've received a few concerns about your yard." "It's not my yard," I said. "It's my land. That's a food plot." She blinked, then smiled. That tight kind of grin that only curled her mouth, never her eyes. "We understand your enthusiasm for sustainability, but agricultural activity isn't permitted in Fair Hollow." I let her finish before I reminded her, politely, that my home was not within the HOA. Her development stopped 50 feet short of my property line. My land was zoned for rural agricultural use. Still was, still legal. She didn't care. This wasn't about law. This was about control. The food shook them, not the rows themselves, but what they meant. A man growing what he needed outside the system, without permission. 3 days later, the first warning came. Then another, certified mail, vague language, unsightly structures, excessive yard activity. I kept the letters, pinned them on the fridge like war medals, took photos, filed them under HOA nonsense. Neighbors stopped waving. Some crossed the street. One, Mitch, whispered to me at the mailbox, "I think what you're doing is great, man. They're just uptight." He looked over his shoulder like he'd just confessed to treason. I didn't stop. I added more crops, a greenhouse, rain barrels, drip irrigation, a root cellar hidden beneath the shed, built not out of paranoia, but experience. I'd seen what happened when supply chains broke. Puerto Rico, after Hurricane Maria, where grandmothers waited 10 hours for a jug of water, where people turned. Vicious overnight, not because they were bad, but because they were starving. It doesn't take fire or bombs to bring collapse. It only takes a hiccup. By mid-June, I had more than I could eat. I gave the rest to the local pantry. One woman cried when I handed her a full bag of collards and okra. That, more than anything, kept me going. But Karen wasn't done. Late July, she came back. This time, she didn't come alone. A landscaper. The HOA treasurer. And someone dressed like private security, badge shining like it meant something. They didn't speak. They pointed, they scribbled. I asked what exactly they were doing. "Documenting violations," the security guy said. "Royce." "What law?" "Community standards." I laughed. Probably shouldn't have. But it all felt like satire, like I'd walked into a bad sitcom where the punchline was always the guy growing turnips. That night, under the full moon, I walked the rows with my dog, Scout, at my side. The corn rustled like soft warnings in the wind. I thought about digging out my old contingency folder, but I didn't. Not yet. I still believed logic would win, that people would see the value in self-sufficiency. That they'd remember who kept growing when the shelves emptied and the power blinked out. Was wrong. The notices turned yellow. Literally, Slips left in my doorframe in cursive font. HOA, friendly reminders about visual uniformity violations. One claimed my rain barrels broke harmony. Another said the greenhouse reflected light. Inconsistently with neighborhood design. One accused my compost tumbler of auditory disruption. That one made me laugh out loud. But behind the laughter, something settled. This wasn't just pushback. This was a campaign. Emails followed. Formal. Cold. Dear resident. Despite the fact that every single one of them knew my name, each one sharpened in tone. Citations, threats, compliance hearings, remediation schedules. Then came the sign. A red laminated board staked at the end of my driveway. This property is under review for non-compliance bold font. All caps, the kind you see on condemned buildings. Neighbors stopped lingering. Some wouldn't. Meet my eyes. Others walked faster past my gate. I didn't remove it. I leaned it against a crate of vegetables at the food pantry the next day. One woman snapped a photo. It ended up online. That same night, Karen returned. Same cup of coffee in her hand, probably bitter and lukewarm. Same smile. But this time, she brought backup. Mr. Callahan, she started, we're here to address your ongoing refusal to adhere to Fair Hollow's aesthetic guidelines. You mean growing food? I asked. Gardens are permitted, she replied. Within reason, your setup exceeds the scope of personal landscaping. It's not landscaping, I said calmly. It's survival. Her lips thinned. Your choices affect property values. I stared at her for a long beat. If your idea of value doesn't include access to food, maybe you're measuring the wrong things? She didn't like that. They filed a complaint with the county, said my property was being reassessed for zoning violations. That's when I smiled. A small one. Because Karen, for all her clipboards and HOA charm, had forgotten one thing. This land had been classified as RA, Rural Agricultural, since 1971, and I had the records to prove it. Her board had bylaws, but my land had the law. They left, flustered. No real answers, no plan. I thought maybe it was over. Maybe they'd move on to a rogue flower pot or the wrong kind of Halloween wreath. But I should have known better. The real storm hadn't hit yet, and the bulldozers were still coming. It started with a hum in the sky. At first, I thought it was just a kid's toy, some teenager testing out their new drone. But when I stepped into the garden and looked up, I saw it. A sleek quadcopter hovering silently over my greenhouse. A tiny HOA sticker pasted to its underside like a badge. It watched me, then zipped off toward the clubhouse. I stood there in the rows, hands in the dirt, heart pounding in a slow, simmering beat. Scout let out a low growl from his spot under the trellis. I didn't say anything. I just looked around, taking in the lay of the land, like I was seeing it through someone else's surveillance lens. They weren't just annoyed anymore. They were watching me. I filed a report with the county sheriff. The deputy shrugged. That HOA again, he muttered. They think the rules give them wings. He didn't even write it down. A few nights later, the laughter came. Not the warm kind that floats on summer air. No, this was sharp, mocking, adolescent. I found out the next morning when someone sent me a link, a video on TikTok titled, The Doomsday Farmer of Fair Hollow, shaky drone footage of my lot. Ominous music, sarcastic voiceovers. Is he growing weed or end of days carrots? Karen better call FEMA before he builds a bunker under the swing set. Someone tell the National Guard this guy's prepping for nuclear fallout. Some of it was cruel. Most of it was ignorant. But one comment stuck with me. It was buried, almost lost in the noise. From a user named Be Prepared Mom. If more people did what he's doing, we wouldn't be in line for powdered milk after every hurricane. I didn't respond. I never do, but I did reinforce the fence, doubled the perimeter, rotated the EI crops more frequently, moved the seed vault into a waterproof container beneath the floorboards of my shed, started vacuum sealing backup packets. Paranoid? No. Prepared. Because I'd seen what happened when people weren't. I ran a free live stream, showing people how to set up home-scale food systems. Over 900 people watched. Most weren't from here. But I could feel something shifting, not just in my neighborhood, but everywhere. Supermarket shelves were thinning, gas prices twitching, storm maps shifting in every weather forecast. The drought. Warnings came next. By late summer, a slow-moving tropical system crawled across the Gulf like a warning with a heartbeat. Supermarkets put up signs, limit 2 cans per person. Rain barrels filled too slowly. Power grid updates became unpredictable. People noticed, even if they didn't want to admit it. Loretta, 2 houses down, the one who never waved, who scowled at my compost bins, came over in a rain jacket one night. "I saw you drying herbs last week," she said quietly. "My husband's got a cough. Pharmacy's out of expectorant. You know anything that works?" I gave her some mullein, showed her how to steep it with thyme. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Then came Mitch again. Only this time, he didn't whisper. He knocked. Asked if I had extra batteries. Said his daughter was scared the power might go out. That's when I knew. The illusion was cracking. Because fear changes people. It breaks the spell of HOA newsletters and carefully crafted community guidelines. And when the storm finally hit, it didn't come quietly. It screamed. Rain sideways, winds like a freight train, power out by nightfall, roads blocked, water. Mains compromised. Cell towers flickered like dying lighthouses, and Fair Hollow shattered. FEMA declared an emergency within 72 hours. People stood in line for stale peanut butter and dry lentils. Shelters filled. Gasoline was rationed. One grocery store generator caught fire. Neighbors dragged spoiled meat into the streets, cooking it over broken grills to salvage what they could before it rotted. The HOA was silent. Then, Karen called. Her voice, usually sharp and rehearsed, came across the voicemail like a bad stage. Play. "Hi there, Mr. Callahan. We just wanted to check in, see how you're holding up. We were wondering if perhaps you might be willing to share some of your supplies with the community. Maybe set up a small produce table near the clubhouse." I stared at my phone for a long time. Not angry. Just stunned. Because while I'd been reinforcing my root cellar, they'd bulldozed the field. Said my greenhouse posed a structural hazard in high winds. Flattened the sweet potatoes, the vertical kale towers, the irrigation lines, the compost bins. The beehive I'd nurtured from a wild colony. All of it. Gone. Not by the storm. By them. Scout barked at the door. Another knock. Probably someone else looking for food. For medicine. For help that no longer existed. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at photos tacked to the wall. Puerto Rico, Haiti, Nevada. Places I'd once held strangers' hands, shared rations, dug through rubble. Because when people are desperate, you help. But this felt different, because the disaster hadn't taken my ability to help. They had. 2 days later, the sun rose over Fair Hollow, stripped bare of its polished image. Lawns drowned in debris, patio furniture twisted in trees, solar lights shattered across walkways like broken fairy dust. Generators buzzed, hope flickered. Thoi. HOA sent a newsletter. Subject line, Resilience Through Community. No one opened it, no one cared. Then they came again. Karen stood on my porch. No entourage this time, just a clipboard man with a tight smile and a corporate polo. Aaron Whitaker. Property Compliance Advisor, he said like it was a title earned. In battle. We're here to discuss post-storm safety, Karen said softly. I didn't move, didn't step aside. He gestured to the ruined garden behind me. Due to proximity and visibility, the board has determined your property falls under extended environmental jurisdiction. The words landed like a punch. Extended. What? Karen cleared her throat. We're trying to move forward, Mr. Callahan. The board recognizes tensions were high. Perhaps this is a chance to rebuild. Together. I stepped outside, walked past them, to the spot where my garden had been. Compost crushed, trellises mangled, the scent of wet basil still lingering, under the mud like a ghost. You want to rebuild? I said, turning to face them. After violating county protections and destroying agricultural land in the middle of a supply crisis? Karen looked away. Aaron fidgeted. I stepped closer. Do you know what that greenhouse produced in 6 months? He replied, hesitant. Miss Whitley said it was mainly decorative. I laughed. One sharp, hollow sound. You think 10 pounds of okra a week is for show? They had no answer. Karen tried again. We're prepared to forgive previous non-compliance if you're willing to help us restart. Perhaps a shared garden, the clubhouse lawn, with oversight and compensation, of course. Healing. Healing. That was the word she chose. I didn't speak. Just turned and walked back across the yard, past the ruins. This land, I said quietly, was the only place in this neighborhood that could have fed people when the truck stopped. And you destroyed it because it didn't match your design manual. I paused. If people go hungry here, it won't be because of the storm. I looked her in the eye. It'll be because of you. Karen opened her mouth. I held up a hand. No, you don't get to spin this. You don't get to bulldoze survival and then call it an opportunity. Then I walked away. I went into the shed, pulled up the floorboard. Inside, sealed seeds, backup plans, documentation. Because I had prepared. Not just for wind or rain, but for this. Because sometimes the storm doesn't come from the sky. Sometimes it comes with clipboards. The morning before it happened, the sky looked too still. Not calm. Still. Scout paced the floor like he knew something was coming. The air was thick, unmoving, the kind that presses against your chest and makes you feel like you're breathing. Through syrup. I didn't know it yet, but that was the last morning the field would still feel like mine. By 6:15 a.m., I was already in my boots, and that's when I heard it. A distant rumble. Not thunder, not a truck. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and the beam caught movement. Something big. Then it emerged. A bulldozer. Behind it, 2 flatbeds. Men in reflective vests, clipboards, hazard tape. They weren't just cleaning. Up after the storm, they were coming for me. I jogged across the backyard, Scout trotting behind me, tail stiff. My heart wasn't racing yet, not fully, by insam, but something deep in my gut started to tighten. They rolled onto the service road behind my garden. Fluorescent spray paint marked my fence line. A large plastic sign was zip-tied to the gate. Unsafe. Structure. Debris removal authorized. I froze. There was no debris here. This wasn't about safety. This was erasure. I stormed up to the nearest guy. Mid-50s, sun-scarred face, walkie clipped to his vest like a sheriff badge. This is my land, I said. You're trespassing. He didn't blink. We have a work order. From who? Fair Hollow Community Board. I laughed, sharp, cold. They don't have jurisdiction here. He shrugged. Doesn't say that on the paperwork. I shoved my phone toward him, pulled up the scanned zoning certificate. RA classification since 1971. He barely glanced at it. Behind him, the bulldozer lowered its blade. The engine started. The machine crawled forward, straight toward the remnants of my greenhouse. I stepped in front of it. Hands up. You need to... Stop. Right now. The site lead waved me off. Sir, for your safety. No, for your convenience. You don't get to bulldoze protected agricultural land under the guise of cleanup. I reached for my phone. Tried calling the sheriff again. Busy line. Tried the mayor's office. No answer. Tried the zoning board. Nothing. All while the machine rolled forward, inch by inch, chewing into the soil I'd spent years building. They tore through everything. The row. Mulch layers. The worm beds. The trellises I'd built with my father's hands. I watched them scoop it all into dumpsters. Like trash. Like it hadn't fed people. Like it hadn't mattered. They didn't see it as a garden. They saw inconvenience. And behind the crew, leaning against her car with arms folded, was Karen. No clipboard, no entourage. Just her and a smirk that faded as I turned to face her. You knew this land was protected, I said. She tilted her head. We believed it posed a structural risk. You bulldozed food. In the middle of a supply chain collapse. It was never approved, she replied flatly, because it didn't need to be. She took a slow breath. Well, at least now we can move forward. Move forward? I stepped toward her. You destroyed survival infrastructure. In a federally declared emergency. You didn't even notify the county. She didn't answer. You're going to hear from my attorney. She smiled, but it was thin now. Weak. This was emergency action. Good luck getting traction. I didn't say another word, but something shifted inside me. Not rage, not grief. Clarity. They'd gone too far. And I had everything I needed to prove it. They thought they were burying a problem, but I'd always been a seed. 3 days later, the wind came back. Not like a whisper, not like a warning. It arrived like a hammer. The second storm hit harder than the first. Rapid intensification, they called it on the news. By the time alerts went out, it was already on us. Grocery stores were empty, batteries gone, water lines strained, the entire region braced. But Fair Hollow wasn't braced. It was already broken. This time, the HOA didn't even pretend. No patrols. No emails. Just silence. Power died again. Cell towers failed. Toilets backed up as the water pressure collapsed. The fire station's bottled water was gone within hours. Neighbors stood in line at churches for spoonfuls of lentils and powdered milk. The facade of order was over. One night, a neighbor's teenager leaked a FEMA memo online. I saved the screenshot. Regional resource distribution severely hampered by suburban HOA interference. Sites with previously reported community gardens or independent food systems, compromised alternative supply hubs, under emergency reassessment. They were talking about me and the garden they destroyed. Fair Hollow hadn't just failed to prepare. It had destroyed its own backup plan. By the third night, people weren't sneering anymore. They were knocking. Karen came again. She didn't look like herself. Her makeup was gone. Her hoodie was soaked through. Her voice smaller. There are families, she said. Babies, elderly, people who haven't eaten in 2 days. I stood in the doorway, silent. You used to have stores, she continued. Seeds, plans, anything, please. I looked behind her. Flashlights bobbed through the dark. Neighbors, holding buckets, grocery bags. They weren't angry. They were hungry. I stepped outside, packet in hand. Not food, not anymore, but maps, planting plans, seed rotation guides, water purification methods. This won't feed you tonight, I said. But it'll teach you how to survive the next one. Karen stared at the packet like it was a foreign language. She took it, slowly. I spoke quietly. Controlled. Tell your board, I'm contacting FEMA and the mayor's office. I have everything. Photos, emails, permits, timestamps. This land was zoned agricultural. You bulldozed it without cause, during an emergency. She didn't argue, she just nodded, and walked into the dark, cradling the packet like it was gold. That night, I stayed up, wrote my statement, attached every piece of evidence, satellite images, demolition orders, my agricultural exemption, community emails, garden logs, footage of the bulldozer rolling in. I hit send 3:02 a.m. By sunrise, my phone exploded. FEMA called first, then a reporter, then the mayor's aide. By noon, a news crew stood at the edge of my ruined garden, filming. That same afternoon, FEMA made it official. Fair Hollow was now classified a compromised zone. No priority aid, no direct supply deliveries. Not until the HOA's internal violations were addressed. They had cut themselves off from help. Neighbors stopped asking for food. They started asking for knowledge, old seeds. Scrap lumber, buckets, fertilizer, the same things they'd mocked, now salvaged like treasure. Mitch came again, this time with his daughter and a box of wood. We're in, he said. You teach, we build, and just like that, something shifted. Not because the HOA changed, but because the people around it finally did. The stars came out the night before everything broke. It was the first clear sky in weeks. No sirens, no wind, Just that strange, heavy silence that settles after chaos like the earth is holding its breath. I sat on the back porch, Scout at my feet, watching moonlight spill over the ruins. The garden was gone, but the smell of it still lingered. Crushed stems, torn leaves, composted roots, like a memory the dirt refused to forget. I hadn't stepped into the field since Karen and her clipboard goon came asking for help. I couldn't. It felt like mourning ground. Instead, I just sat there in the dark, thinking about Haiti, about Nevada after the fires, about the places where I'd held strangers' hands and offered food from rations that barely stretched, and how this was different. Because this time, it hadn't been nature or war that broke the system. It was bureaucracy, it was neighbors, and they weren't ready for what was coming next, not even close. Just before dawn, Scout growled, low and sharp. I sat up, boots on before I was even fully awake. A sound reached my ears, mechanical, heavy, deliberate. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. There, at the far end of the street, a bulldozer, 2 flatbeds behind it, loaded with industrial dumpsters and earth-moving equipment, the same kind of convoy I'd seen used to clear refugee sites in flood zones. They weren't here to clean up storm damage. They were here for erasure. Again. I jogged across the backyard and ducked behind the hedge line. The first bulldozer had already begun marking ground. Hazard signs planted, safety vests fanned out like clockwork, clipboards, spray paint, zone tape. This wasn't spontaneous. This was organized, coordinated, targeted. One worker unrolled a bright, orange banner. Unsafe structure, debris removal authorized. But there was no debris. Just my soil, my seed beds, my dad's old workbench. Crushed rain barrels still catching the last few drops of storm runoff. I stepped out from behind the hedge, hands raised. Who authorized this? One guy barely looked up. Talked to the site lead. I found him. Tall, late 50s, weathered. Skin. Clipboard tucked under one arm like a badge. This is my land, I said. RA zoned since 1971. Agricultural protected. You're trespassing. He didn't flinch. We've got a work order. Came from Fair Hollow. The HOA doesn't have jurisdiction here, he shrugged. Doesn't say that on the paperwork. The blade of the bulldozer lowered with a mechanical sigh, started to roll. I moved fast, stepped in front of it. Stop. Right now. The engine cut for a moment. The operator looked to the lead. Sir? The man warned me. If you interfere, we'll have to call law enforcement. I am law enforcement, I growled. Retired. And you're breaking zoning codes, county statutes, and emergency order protocol. He didn't back down. Instead, he handed me a paper, stamped, initialed, by Karen Emergency Demolition Authorization, filed under the HOA's Disaster Response Clause. No county seal, no official zoning approval, just a forged form hiding behind. A technicality. They'd found a loophole, and they were using it to wipe the last remnants of my work off the map. I tried calling the mayor, voicemail, tried the city attorney. Rang, no pickup. Tried standing in front of the blade again, but this. Time they were ready. You'll be removed, the lead said, voice cold. We'll charge you with obstruction. The engine roared back to life. I stepped back, powerless, and watched as they tore through everything. The soil I'd layered with care, compost, worm castings, mulch, scooped like garbage. The trellises I'd hand-built from salvaged barnwood, tossed into a dumpster, my rainwater filtration system, shattered like scrap metal. The greenhouse, God, the greenhouse gone. Every salvaged window pane, every herb stand, every piece of carefully rigged solar venting, flattened and through. It all, Karen never showed, not until the machines were gone. The dust settled. She arrived like royalty stepping onto a conquered kingdom, boots crunching over broken tomato cages, hands in her coat pockets. No clipboard now, no entourage, just her, smiling, faintly, like it hadn't cost her anything at all. I'm sorry it had to come to this, she said, not sounding sorry at all. You knew it was protected land, I whispered. She tilted her head. We believed it posed a risk. Better safe than sorry. You bulldozed food, I said. In the middle of a supply crisis. She blinked. It was never approved. Because it didn't need to be. She sighed. Well, at least now we can move forward. Clean slate. I took a step toward her. I want you off my land. She hesitated. You'll hear from my attorney. Oh, I said, my voice flat. We're way past that. She turned to leave. But I didn't feel defeated. Not this time. Because as I stared across the wreckage, a strange kind of focus settled over me. It wasn't anger anymore. It was purpose. They had pushed too far. They didn't just bulldoze my garden. They triggered a movement. 3 days later, the second storm hit, harder, faster, angrier. Fair Hollow was still reeling from the first. Now it broke completely. They called it a critical infrastructure collapse, but we called it something else. The blackout week, power, gone, water, contaminated, sewage, backed up, food, vanished. The trucks weren't coming. The roads were flooded. Even FEMA convoys couldn't get in. People turned on their stoves and nothing happened. Turned on their faucets and heard air. Kids cried. Elderly. Neighbors passed out from dehydration. It didn't take days, it took hours. And in that chaos, a screenshot spread like wildfire. A leaked FEMA memo. Sites with previously reported community gardens or independent food systems. Compromised HOA interference noted. Priority reassessment pending. My garden. My garden. Karen showed up again. This time, she didn't bother dressing the part. Her hair was soaked. Her jacket was stained with sweat and ash. She didn't look powerful anymore. She looked real. There are families, she whispered. Kids who haven't eaten since yesterday, please. Behind her, figures moved in the shadows. People I used to call neighbors, some I barely recognized. They weren't angry, they were afraid. I held up a laminated packet, waterproof inside, planting plans, soil remediation guides, water purification steps. I can't feed you, I said, but I can teach you how to feed yourselves. Karen took it like it was a holy relic. I'm contacting FEMA and the county and the press. I have everything. Timestamps, permits, footage. She didn't argue, she just nodded, turned away, and disappeared into the dark. I sat down at my kitchen table, lit a lantern, opened my laptop, and began typing. The storm had passed, but the flood was just beginning. Not water. Truth. It started with a red blinking cursor on a blank email. I stared at it for a long time before typing a single subject line. Urgent. Destruction of agricultural infrastructure. Fair Hollow HOA. Attached were 47 documents, scanned permits, zoning classifications, time-stamped satellite images, before and after the bulldozing. Audio clips of voicemails, screenshots of HOA emails, and one photo that stopped people cold. A child in line outside. The church food pantry clutching a peanut butter sandwich like it was gold, her eyes hollow, my rows of sweet potatoes, now tire tracks behind her. I hit send, CC'd FEMA, the county commissioner, the city council, the press, the Department of Emergency Preparedness. I didn't expect what happened next. Within 12 hours, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. FEMA called first, then the mayor's aide, then a reporter from the regional news, and finally, a national news anchor with a name I recognized from evening broadcasts. They wanted to send a camera crew, now. By mid-afternoon, a van rolled into Fair Hollow. A woman stepped out, blazer pressed, mic in hand, Helena Price, the kind of journalist whose voice had narrated wildfires, war zones, and hurricane aftermaths. She wasn't here for a puff piece. She walked through the ruins of my garden like she was stepping through a battlefield. All of this, she said quietly. It used to be a farm. A garden, I corrected. A food system. Efficient. Quiet. Local. And they bulldozed it? They called it a hazard. We filmed the interview by the old compost pile. now half crushed. She asked questions with surgical precision. Why did you start the garden? What led to the conflict? How did it feel to lose it? I didn't cry, didn't yell. I just told the truth about what it meant to prepare, about the difference between appearances and actual safety, about what it feels like to watch people mock you for building lifeboats and then try to climb aboard. When the floodwaters rise, she asked one last question. What do you want people to take away from this? I looked straight at the lens, that we confuse comfort with preparedness, that we design communities to look safe instead of be safe. And when someone breaks that illusion, we'd rather silence them than listen. Her camera operator turned off the rig. You just made the evening lead, he said. He wasn't wrong. That night, the footage aired across the region. By morning, it had over 300,000 views, and by noon, there was a knock on my door. Not from the HOA, from the city. Yay. Mayor himself, gray suit, no tie. Eyes bloodshot. He didn't waste time. Callahan, he said, on behalf of the city, I want to formally apologize. I said nothing. He continued. I didn't know. Not all of it. Not until I saw that footage. The before and after. That kid holding the sandwich. His voice broke for a second. Then came the words I didn't expect. We're launching an investigation into the HOA, zoning violations, unauthorized demolition, interference with emergency infrastructure. It's going to be public, and it's going to be real. I nodded. I don't want revenge, I said. I want change. He didn't hesitate. I want you on the new Municipal Resilience Advisory Committee. We need people who know what it means to prepare, not just manage. I agreed. Within the week, Fair Hollow's HOA was stripped of enforcement authority. They were allowed to remain. In name only. A voluntary association. No power, no punishments, no bulldozers. 5 other neighborhoods filed similar complaints that same week. One had fined a woman for planting fruit trees. Another had removed rain barrels from a veteran's yard citing visual disruption. A retired firefighter in Arizona emailed me, said his native herb garden was uprooted due to potential fire risk. He sent photos. The same orange hazard tape, the same blank stares, the same loss. So we started a coalition. Just a simple forum at first, Sovereign Sprouts, a place to share resources, legal templates, live stream links, survival guides. Within 2 months, we had over 10,000 members, farmers, teachers, veterans, single parents, city planners, people who were tired of being punished for trying to feed themselves. A few lawyers among us drafted a bill, the Food Resilience Freedom Act. It proposed legal safeguards for small-scale non-commercial agriculture, even within HOA-governed zones. 3 state senators co-sponsored it, and still, the garden began to grow again, not mine, ours. Each bed was adopted by someone new. Mitch installed a rainwater harvesting system. Loretta led composting workshops in the now unused clubhouse. Teenagers, the same ones who once filmed my garden, from a drone, now maintained bee boxes and soil logs. Every weekend, we hosted seed swaps and soil testing. People brought what they could, and for the first time in a long time, nobody asked permission. One Saturday, I stood in the middle of it all, hands dirty, shirt soaked, boots caked in mulch. The kale was back, the tomatoes glowing red, the corn whispering in the breeze. A girl, no older than 12, stood next to me, cradling a small potted cucumber sprout. "This one's mine," she said proudly. I crouched beside her. "That's a good one." She looked up. "My mom says, you saved us." I shook my head. "No, sweetheart. You all saved yourselves. I just planted the first seed. And maybe that's all it took." A year later, the scars still remained. Barely. The ruts from the bulldozers were filled in. The greenhouse had been rebuilt. This time with insulated panels and solar vents. A new sign hung over the gate. Community. Roots, grown by everyone. And this time, it wasn't just Fair Hollow. Towns across the state began adopting the same model: community resilience zones, HOA-exempt food gardens, neighborhood barter stations. It spread, not like a wildfire, but like Seeds on the wind, no longer whispers, no longer apologies, just action, rebuilding, together. The first subpoena came on a Monday morning. Plain envelope, thick, heavy in the way paper gets when it carries something more than ink. I opened it at the mailbox, Scout sitting at my side, tail flicking in the dirt. The return address, county office of administrative hearings. Inside, a hearing notice, signed, stamped. Not for me, for the Fair Hollow HOA board. The charges were precise. Unauthorized demolition of registered agricultural use land, fraudulent misuse of emergency authority, zoning interference during declared disaster status, violation of municipal food resilience policy. I read it twice, and then again. The mail carrier. Passed by, slowed, smirked. Been delivering a lot of those lately, he said. Looks like someone finally lit a fire. He wasn't wrong. Within a week, every remaining board member, Todd, Marcy, the ones who used to sit behind Karen like backup singers at town hall meetings, had been summoned to testify. The public would be allowed to attend. I didn't plan to go. I had nothing to prove. My garden had already spoken. But then neighbors started stopping me in the street. People who once turned their backs now held out handwritten notes, printed screenshots, newspaper clippings. They weren't asking for food anymore. They were asking for a seat at the truth. So I went. The morning of the hearing, I wore a clean flannel shirt. Boots shined. Scout left at home. Not because I wanted to dress up, but because I understood what moments like this meant. Moments where silence becomes permission, and speaking becomes responsibility. The county building buzzed with tension. Former HOA loyalists sat stiff in their seats. Others looked away when I passed. Mitch gave me a quiet nod. Loretta sat in the front row, a battered notebook in her lap. When the board entered, the room fell still. Karen wasn't with them. She'd resigned weeks before, disappearing from town, under the cover of humiliation and silence. Her nameplate still sat on the table. President, Fair Hollow HOA. It felt like a joke. Todd sat next to it, pale, rigid. Marcy clutched a tablet she never looked up from. The commissioner opened the hearing with a simple statement. This inquiry will determine whether the Fair Hollow Homeowners Association acted within its legal authority when it authorized the destruction of protected agricultural property during a declared state of emergency. Then the testimonies began. The city zoning director confirmed the obvious. My land was RA zoned. Always had been. The FEMA representative explained how Fair Hollow was downgraded on the emergency distribution map. A direct result of local interference with food infrastructure. Then came the document trail, screenshots of emails, copies of the demolition order, signed by Karen, never validated by the county, photos of the garden, before and after. The contrast was damning. Then they called me. Stood slowly, walked forward, no nerves. No script, just truth. I served in 4 disaster zones, I began. I've seen what happens when systems fail. Not on the news, not in theory. With my own eyes. People don't starve because nature is cruel. They starve because communities fail to prepare. I paused. Let the silence settle. That's why I built my garden. Not to rebel, not to grandstand. To survive. And maybe to help others survive. I held up a photograph, the same one Helena Price had shown in her broadcast. The child at the food line. Behind her, a smoldering memory of what had been my garden. They called my food unsightly, I said. Then they begged me for what it used to provide. I sat down. No applause, just stillness. Then the commissioner read the findings. The HOA had violated county zoning law. They had forged emergency documentation. They had interfered with a FEMA-recognized food resilience system. Their enforcement rights were revoked, permanently. The county would place Fair Hollow under municipal oversight until a new, elected, regulated board could be established. One with transparency, term limits, and no authority over food systems. It was done. A win. But not just for me. Other communities were watching. One woman in Tennessee emailed me that same night. Her HOA fined her for planting blueberries in her front yard. She forwarded the footage from my case to her city council. A veteran in Oregon sent photos of his own demolished greenhouse, said they'd cited view obstruction. His HOA president had used language almost identical to Karen's. Not approved, not aesthetic, not within design harmony. Within 2 weeks, Sovereign Sprouts had tripled in size. 10,000 became 30. Our bill, the Food Resilience Freedom Act, gained 3 more co-sponsors, then 5, and then a vote. Unanimous. Passed small-scale agriculture, protected even. In HOA territory. You'd think that would be the end, but it wasn't, because what happened next was bigger than politics, bigger than law. It was cultural, it was quiet, and it was powerful. Neighbors didn't just thank me, they asked to learn. The clubhouse, once a symbol of control, became a workshop space. Loretta taught water purification, Mitch ran energy backup demos, teenagers hosted seed exchanges. We built a barter board, fresh herbs traded for solar chargers, jars of canned tomatoes exchanged for repair help. We weren't just recovering, we were rebuilding. Together. One afternoon, a man in a suit showed up, clipboard tie, polished shoes. He said he worked for a national nonprofit focused on urban sustainability. He'd seen the interview. He wanted to help replicate it, not just here, everywhere. We began assembling a starter kit. Community victory patch, a resilience box. It included crop rotation templates, rain catchment blueprints, emergency preservation guides, printable signage, feed first, ask later. We shipped the first 500 boxes within a month. Then $1,000 cities in 4 states reached out to draft similar zoning protections. One even named their new community garden after us, the Callahan Patch. I didn't ask for that, but I was honored. Not because it bore my name, because it meant people were listening, that they were planting, that they weren't waiting for permission anymore. The garden was never mine again, not after the hearing, not after the videos, not after the subpoenas landed on HOA doorsteps like overdue bills. What once was private, guarded, solitary, had become something else entirely. Ours. The weeds grew. Slower now. The rows were straighter, the laughter louder, and the silence. It meant something different now. It wasn't fear, it was peace. We named it the Victory Patch, not for irony, not for nostalgia, but as a quiet declaration. A nod to the wartime gardens of generations past, those scrappy plots born from necessity and grit. But this time it wasn't war. It was realization. We'd built our own battlefield, and we were finally planting peace. By spring, the lot was thriving, again, not just in produce, but in purpose. The clubhouse no longer held HOA hearings about mailbox paint shades or unauthorized flagpoles. Now it hosted seed banks, composting workshops, rain barrel repairs, medicinal herb seminars, Saturday barter swaps. Loretta had become something of a legend. At 68, she ran the fermentation club like a boot camp. Sauerkraut, kimchi, vinegar pickles, all lined up in mismatched jars like trophies of resilience. Mitch rigged a backup solar grid using repurposed panels from an old community center in town. Teenagers installed thermal composters. One even developed an app that let neighbors log their produce yields and share excess in real time. Nobody had permission, nobody needed it, because the HOA no longer had the power to give or deny. We didn't vote for that. We simply decided it was true, and somehow, that was enough. Even the children were different now. Once locked behind screens and structured playdates, they now chased butterflies between basil rows and built ladybug hotels from mason jars and pine cones. They didn't call me crazy farmer anymore. They called me Mr. Joe, or sometimes just Sir. And that meant more than any title. Because the truth is, I hadn't set out to lead anything. I just wanted to prepare. But sometimes the world doesn't wait for your permission either. Sometimes it chooses you, and sometimes it starts with a letter. This one came not from Karen, not from the county, but from a town 3 hours north, a city official named Amina. She'd watched our story unfold through the news and live streams. She asked for help drafting her own Resilience Zone Ordinance. She wasn't the only one. A town in Kansas wanted to repurpose an abandoned park. A church in Mississippi needed help turning its backlot into a medicinal herb grove. Rural school district in Pennsylvania asked how to start a seed-to-lunch program, so I said yes. Not all at once. Not because I knew everything, but because I knew enough. And enough is all you need to begin. I traveled, spoke at town halls, testified. At state policy hearings, helped veterans set up permaculture rows behind a fire station, gave a TEDx talk, titled it, "The Garden They Destroyed Became the Blueprint We Needed." It went viral. Not because I said anything new, but because I said it simply. Because I told the truth. That food systems shouldn't rely on trucks and fragile grids. That communities should know how to feed themselves. That resilience isn't paranoia, it's Love.Sovereign Sprouts became a registered nonprofit. We partnered with cities, built mobile kits for emergency gardens, published a free guide titled Start Small, Grow Loud. We sent it to 500 libraries, 2,000 schools. We hosted live streams. Some had 5,000 viewers, others had 50. Didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. A retired teacher in Kansas mailed me heirloom okra seeds with a handwritten note. My grandfather grew these during the Dust Bowl. Yours will too. A family in Oregon sent me a resilience guide their grandmother had written after Mount St. Helens erupted. A boy in Maine drew a picture of our garden and mailed it with 3 dandelions pressed between paper, on the eye. Envelope from one seed to another. I didn't cry. Not right away. But that cracked me open. Back home, we kept building. The greenhouse, rebuilt stronger, this time with insulated panels, a solar venting system, and raised propagation beds for seedlings. It fed not just us, but entire sections of the neighborhood. The seed bank grew, literal and symbolic. One strain, a Cherokee purple tomato preserved by a family in Appalachia for 5 generations, arrived in a velvet-lined box with a note. We trust you with this. I didn't take that lightly. Scout aged with grace, his muzzle went silver, his steps slower. But every morning, he followed me out to the rows, still barked at squirrels like they owed him rent. Children fed him bits of jerky, called him General, Scout, and I let them. He'd earned it. One Sunday, while harvesting squash, Mitch's youngest, Eli, asked me something. He held a bucket full of marigolds, cheeks smudged with soil. Do you miss the way it used to be? Before all this? Paused, wiped my brow. No, I said. I miss the peace I thought I had, but not the ignorance that came with it. He didn't fully understand, but one day he would. Later that week, the mayor called. He wanted my help drafting a new emergency preparedness guide for the entire county. I said yes, under one condition. Start the section on food security with a story. My story. Not to glorify what happened, but to remind people what almost didn't, what nearly died beneath a bulldozer's blade, and what still managed to rise. The final lines of that guide would read, "Don't wait for permission to do what's right. Because when disaster comes, the soil won't ask what rules you followed. It will only ask what you planted. And in that truth, there is justice. And in that justice, healing. And in that healing, we grow again." It didn't happen overnight. Change rarely does. The bulldozer tracks faded. The wreckage was cleared. New seedlings replaced the ones flattened in the mud. But the real rebuilding? That happened in people. In the way they looked at each other. In the way they talked. And most of all, in the way they listened. The garden, the victory patch, bloomed again. This time, not as mine, as ours. You could see it in every corner, trellises made from salvaged fence wood, raised beds built from old shipping pallets, compost bins painted by kids with phrases like, "Nourish the earth, nourish us." Grow loud. Community roots. We didn't ask the HOA's permission, because the HOA, as it once existed, no longer had the power to grant or deny. We didn't need gatekeepers, we had gardeners. The city council passed a new designation, resilience. Zone Our Garden was the first. It came with grant funding, zoning protection, and legal immunity from ornamental landscaping laws. Other neighborhoods followed. The clubhouse, once a symbol of control, was reborn. Now it housed a solar charging station, a rain filtration system, a barter pantry, a teaching kitchen. Where there used to be committees for mailbox aesthetics, there were now sign-up sheets for compost rotations and seed packing shifts. Loretta became something of an icon. She taught Saturday canning circles like a general. Even started a barter wall, services, tools, food, all traded in kindness. The children? They were the biggest change of all. They didn't grow up watching HOA board meetings. They grew up learning how to sprout seeds, how to preserve strawberries, how to test soil pH with cabbage water and science kits made from egg cartons. They weren't waiting for trucks anymore. They were planting their own supply chains, and in the middle of it all, Scout, older now, slower, but still there, every morning, sitting in the shade at the edge of the greenhouse, watching, protecting. The kids called him the general. He'd earned that. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a small town across the state. They'd followed our story. They were drafting their own resilience ordinance, wanted help. So I drove down, met their city planner, walked their school grounds, stood behind their library where a flat patch of dirt waited to become something more. Will it work? The woman asked me. I knelt, dug my fingers into the soil, felt its weight, its texture, its quiet promise. Yes, I said. Because you're asking the right question. We built it together. The first sprout popped up 2 weeks later. A single bean, but it was enough. When I got home, I found a boy waiting by the gate, Eli. He held a potted tomato seedling, not for himself, for Scout. He said, "It's his now. He guards it." I smiled, throat tight. Sometimes healing doesn't look like forgiveness. It looks like a child giving your dog a plant. It looks like a town growing food where there once was only lawn. It looks like a community that learned, not from fear, but from failure. A few months later, Helena Price returned. This time, it wasn't a camera crew. It was just her. No microphone, just a notepad and a folded newspaper under her arm. She handed it to me. Front page headline, "One Garden." Quietly grown now, changing cities across America. She looked around the garden, then back at me. Do you think it'll last? I watched the kids tugging wheelbarrows through the rows, watched Loretta lead a compost bin demonstration, watched a teenage girl teach her younger brother how to use a soil tester. I don't know, I said, but I know it started something. She nodded, smiling. Then she asked, do you ever think about what would have happened if they hadn't bulldozed it? I looked at the rebuilt greenhouse, at the mural the kids had painted of Scout with his paw print in the corner, at the row of fruit trees that once were forbidden, now bearing small green plums, and I said, I think we might have stayed asleep. Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what you had. Sometimes it takes injustice to ignite justice. Sometimes a bulldozer clears the way for something better. Later that year, we hosted a regional seed fair. People came from 6 counties. 1 woman brought Cherokee corn. Another brought seeds saved from her grandmother's garden in post-war Berlin. We swapped, we shared, we remembered, because seeds aren't just food, they're stories. They carry memory. And now, they carried us. The last visitor of the day was an older man with a crooked hat and leather gloves. He didn't say much, just walked the rows, touching the leaves, nodding to himself. At the end, he turned to me and said, you didn't just grow a garden, you grew people. That night, I stood in the greenhouse with the lights off. The moon cut across the beds like a silver scar. Scout lay at my feet. The air was thick with basil and warm soil, and for the first time in years, I felt safe, not because the system had changed, but because we had. We didn't need perfection. We needed roots, and we had them now. Strong, deep, unbreakable. So if the storms came again, and they would, we'd be ready. Not with clipboards or bylaws, with soil, with seeds, with each other. Because that's what community means. Not control, but care. Not compliance, but courage. Not silence, but stewardship. One garden, one neighborhood, one moment of quiet defiance. That was all it took, to remind the world what it means to grow again.